The calls didn't stop suddenly, they thinned, like light fading at dusk. Then one quiet evening, a bank statement arrived in the mail, and something in its numbers felt like a voice I didn't want to hear. I live alone in a narrow house at the edge of town, where the mornings arrive softly and nothing much changes. My son used to call every Sunday, always in a rush, always saying he'd visit soon. When the calls slowed and then stopped, I told myself it was just life moving forward, until a routine glance at my bank account unsettled that belief. Some silences, I would learn, are not empty at all. The afternoon light was already thinning when the phone rang. Gray light, the kind that settles into corners and doesn't ask permission. I remembered the laundry humming in the other room, the slow, patient spin of it, like the house was breathing on its own. I wiped my hands on a dish towel before answering. I don't know why. Old habits, maybe. Wanting to sound ready, his voice came through the line soft and familiar, like a song I'd known for years but hadn't heard in a while. "Hey, Mom," he said, not rushed, not warm either, just there. I stood by the counter, phone pressed to my ear, watching the kettle sit silent on the stove. He talked about work first, deadlines, meetings that ran too long, then traffic. Always traffic. The weather followed. Rain somewhere near him, clouds moving in. Small things, safe things. I nodded even though he couldn't see me, answered when I was supposed to. That sounds tiring. Oh, I heard about that. There were pauses between his sentences, not the comfortable kind. They felt measured, like he was stepping around something on the floor, careful not to touch it. I leaned against the counter and listened to the way his breath changed when I asked simple questions. "How are you really?" He laughed softly, too quickly. "Same old stuff," he said. The washing machine clicked off in the other room. Sudden silence. It felt louder than it should have. I waited for him to fill it. He did, end single quotes so I folded a towel while he spoke again, smoothing the fabric slowly, lining the edges the way I always had. My hands knew what to do even if my heart didn't. He mentioned a co-worker's birthday, a long drive home, nothing that stayed long enough to matter. There was a moment when neither of us spoke, just the faint sound of the line still open. I held my breath without meaning to. This was usually when he said it, always at the end. Sometimes quick, sometimes awkward, but always there. "I'll call you next week," he said instead. The words landed softly, too softly. "All right," I replied. My voice sounded steady, even to me. We said goodbye like we always did. No arguments, no raised voices, just routine. When the call ended, I didn't move right away. The phone stayed in my hand. Warm from his voice, the house felt still, like it was waiting for something that didn't arrive. I finished folding the laundry, placed each piece where it belonged. I told myself it meant nothing. People forget things. People get busy. But later, when evenings settled in and the gray light finally disappeared, I realized something had followed me all day. Not his words, not the call. It was what he didn't say. And the way that quiet stayed with me longer than his voice ever did. The phone stayed on the kitchen counter like it always had, face up, silent. Morning light slid across the surface of it, soft and pale, catching the edges before moving on. I noticed it every time I passed by, even when I told myself I wasn't looking. The kettle boiled, the clock ticked. The house went about its quiet business without interruption. Days folded into each other gently. Then weeks did the same. I started checking the phone more often than I needed to. Not opening it, just touching it, wiping the screen with my sleeve, brushing away dust that wasn't really there. It felt like tending to something living, like if I kept it clean enough, it might respond. Outside, the season shifted slowly. Leaves gathered near the steps and stayed there. The mail arrived at the same hour each afternoon, thudding softly against the door. Nothing unexpected, nothing missing except him. When neighbors saw me, they asked the way people always do. "How's your son?" Casual, kind, unthinking. I smiled because that's what was expected. Oh, he's busy, I said. Working a lot. I said it easily, like I'd practiced. Because I had. Their faces nodded in understanding, and the conversation moved on to weather or groceries or someone's new fence. No one lingered on the question. I didn't either. Words can move past things if you let them. At night, the house spoke in its old language. The floor creaked near the hallway, the way it always had. Pipes knocked once before settling. The refrigerator hummed steadily. Dependable. These sounds used to comfort me, prove that nothing had changed. But now, they felt different. Hollow. Somehow, like echoes without a source. I lay in bed listening, staring at the ceiling where faint shadows shifted with passing headlights. My thoughts moved slower at night, heavier. I replayed conversations from months ago, then years. Small moments I hadn't paid much attention to at the time. His voice when he said he was tired. The way he rushed off the phone. How he promised to visit but never set a date. None of it had seemed important then. Life moves forward. I told myself, children grow busy, distance becomes normal. Still, the questions crept in quietly. Had I missed something? A change in his tone. A pause I ignored. I remembered times I'd talked more than listened. Times I'd filled silence because it made me uncomfortable. Maybe the signs were there, thin as hairline cracks, and I'd stepped right over them. The phone stayed where it was. Some evenings, I carried it with me from room to room, set it beside the sink, then the table, then the arm of the couch, as if proximity mattered, as if it might feel my patience. It never rang. Eventually, I stopped expecting it to. That was the part that frightened me most. The way hope softened into something quieter, something careful. One night, as I turned off the kitchen light, I paused and looked back at the counter. The phone sat in the dark, unmoving, perfectly ordinary, and I realized the quiet had weight now. It pressed instead of drifted. Absence, I understood then, doesn't arrive all at once. It grows, and one day, it's heavier than anything that was ever there. The mail landed against the door with its usual dull sound. Paper on wood, nothing urgent in it, nothing loud. Sunlight fell across the floor in a thin stripe, stopping just short of the welcome mat. I bent to gather the envelopes, stacking them against my palm the way I always did. Grocery flyers, coupons I'd never use. One white envelope, with the bank's name printed neatly in the corner. I carried it all to the kitchen table and set it down beside my tea. The steam rose slowly, then disappeared. The house felt calm, predictable, trustworthy. I opened the envelope without thinking. That's important. Without thinking, the paper unfolded cleanly, smooth and stiff. Rows of numbers waited patiently, lined up the way they always were. Dates, balances, small movements in and out, familiar as breathing. I scanned it the way you scan something you've seen 100 times. Eyes moving faster than meaning. Comforted by order. Then my gaze stopped. One line held me there. A withdrawal. Not large. Not dramatic. Just unfamiliar. I leaned back in the chair and read it again. Slower this time. My finger traced a date, then the amount, then the location printed beside it. The tea had gone untouched. I noticed that only because the steam was gone. I told myself it was nothing. A forgotten errand. A moment I'd misplaced. But memory didn't rise to meet the explanation. It stayed still. The room felt quieter than before. Not empty, just attentive. Like it was waiting to see what I would do next. I turned the page, half expecting clarification. A note. A correction. Something that would make the line behave. But the numbers stayed where they were. Calm. Certain. Official. I folded the paper once, then opened it again. Read the line a third time. Each reading made it heavier. Like a word spoken too often starts to lose its sound and keep only its meaning. I thought about the last time I'd gone to the bank. I pictured the counter, the glass, the pen chained to its base. Nothing matched the date. Nothing matched the amount. My hands rested on the table, palms down. I noticed a small scratch in the wood I hadn't seen before. The clock ticked once, twice. It wasn't fear that came first. It was confusion. The kind that settles quietly. The kind that asks questions without urgency. Why didn't I remember this? Why did it look so intentional? I glanced toward the hallway, toward the room where the old folders lived, the ones I rarely opened. Papers from years ago, stacked neatly because I believed neatness meant safety. The bank statement lay open in front of me, unbothered by my thoughts. It didn't accuse. It didn't explain. It simply existed. I realized then how easily trust becomes routine. How rarely we look closely at the things we believe are solid. I folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Not because I was done with it, but because I wasn't ready. As I stood and carried my cup to the sink, one thought stayed with me, steady and unkind in its patience. If this line was true, what else had been happening without my knowing? The house stayed quiet, but the numbers had already spoken. The afternoon light shifted while I sat there. Not quickly, just enough to change the color of the table. I spread the bank statement out again, smoothing it with both hands like it might wrinkle if I didn't treat it carefully. The paper felt cool, official, certain. I traced the lines with my eyes, slower now, giving each number the time it seemed to want. That's when I noticed the pattern. The amounts weren't random. They carried a kind of restraint. Not round enough to be careless, not large enough to be loud. Each withdrawal sat at a careful distance from the next, like footsteps placed deliberately to avoid sound. I counted days between them, paused, counted again. The spacing felt practiced. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The house stayed still around me. Somewhere, a bird tapped at the window once, then flew off. I tried to place myself inside those dates. I pictured the grocery store aisles, the familiar weight of a basket against my hip, the gas station down the road, the way the pump always clicked too early, the pharmacy where the clerk knew my name. None of it matched. I flipped through my calendar, pages whispering as they turned, appointments written in my own careful hand. Nothing circled, no trips, no errands that stretched beyond the usual. The numbers didn't belong to my days. That realization arrived quietly, without ceremony. It settled in my chest the way cold does when you don't notice the door has been left open. My name was printed at the top of the page, clear, undeniable. This was my account, my history. But the rhythm felt off, like a song played at the wrong speed. I thought about my routines, how I liked to shop in the mornings, how I avoided weekends, how I counted change before leaving the store. Someone who knew me would know those things, someone who watched closely enough. The idea made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite name. Not fear, not yet. More like the sense of being observed long after the room has emptied. I folded the statement, then unfolded it again, as if repetition might loosen its grip. But each time I read it, the pattern grew clearer, intentional, considerate almost. I imagined hands not my own at a counter I knew well, a card sliding through a machine, a signature practiced to look like mine, or maybe not needed at all. The house creaked behind me, a familiar sound, one I'd trusted for years. I stood and walked to the window, pressing my fingertips lightly against the glass. Outside, the street looked the same as always, ordinary, safe. Inside, something had shifted. I realized then that randomness would have been easier. A mistake, a glitch, something to call about and correct. Patterns, though, require intention, and intention requires knowledge. I returned to the table and gathered the papers into a neat stack. My hands moved carefully, deliberately. I wasn't ready to confront anything yet, but I could no longer ignore what I was seeing. The question didn't ask itself loudly. It waited. Who knew me well enough to move through my life without leaving a trace? The light faded further, and the numbers stayed where they were. Calm, patient, watching. The kettle clicked off before it whistled. I noticed because I was standing right there, watching it, waiting for a sound that didn't come. The kitchen paused, like it was holding its breath along with me. I poured the water anyway. Steam rose, then vanished. So did my certainty. I sat at the table with the bank statement folded neatly beside my cup, untouched. I told myself I didn't need to look at it again. I already knew what it said, or at least what it suggested. Still, I kept it close. Like a note you're not ready to read aloud, I began offering myself explanations. Gentle ones. Maybe he was short 1 month. Maybe pride got in the way of telling me. He'd always hated asking for help. Maybe he planned to explain everything later, once things settled. Once he had time, the ideas came easily. Too easily. I imagined a phone call that fixed it all. My voice calm, almost cheerful. I noticed something odd, I'd say. A pause. Then his familiar laugh. "Oh, that," he'd reply. "I meant to tell you." I practiced the tone in my head. Light, understanding, the kind a mother uses when she wants to keep the door open. I nodded along to the imagined conversation, my hands wrapped around the warm mug. The tea tasted faint. I realized I hadn't added sugar. The house creaked softly as I shifted in my chair, a sound I'd known for years. Reliable. It reminded me how long I'd lived inside patterns I trusted. Every explanation I made required him to still be that boy. The one who used to over-explain himself. The one who couldn't keep a secret, even when he tried. The one who called just to hear my voice, even when he had nothing to say. I stared at the folded paper. What if that boy had changed? The thought didn't arrive loudly. It slipped in between breaths, between sips of tea. It carried no accusation, just possibility. I thought about the last few calls, how careful his words had sounded, how he'd kept things short, how easily he moved past questions. I stood and walked to the sink, rinsing the mug even though I wasn't finished. The water ran too long. I let it. Some sounds are easier than silence. I caught my reflection in the window above the sink. Older than I felt, still familiar. I wondered if he saw me the same way now, or if time had changed that too. Back at the table, I unfolded the statement once more, not to study it, just to acknowledge it. The numbers didn't argue. They waited. I realized then how much effort it takes to protect a memory of someone. How carefully we shape explanations to preserve who they used to be. Love does. That. So does fear. I folded the paper again and placed it back in the envelope. My hands trembled slightly this time. Not enough to spill anything, just enough to notice. I wasn't ready to stop believing. But belief, I understood, had started to feel like work. As evening light dimmed the room, one question stayed with me, quiet and persistent. If he wasn't the person I remembered, who was he becoming? The rain had been tapping the windows for a while before I noticed it, soft at first, careful, like it didn't want to interrupt anything. I stood in the living room with the lamp on, the rest of the house dim and patient around me. The phone felt heavier in my hand than it should have. I watched the screen light up as I pressed his name, the familiar letters glowing against the quiet. It rang. Once. Twice. Each ring stretched longer than the last, filling the room in a way sound shouldn't be able to. I listened to the rain, to the ticking clock, to my own breathing trying to stay even. Then his voicemail picked up. "Hey. It's me," his recorded voice said, too bright, too distant, like a version of him preserved in time. I froze for a second. Hearing him without him hearing me felt wrong. The voice didn't carry warmth the way it used to. I wondered how long it had been since he recorded it, how long since I'd really known the sound of him. I waited for the beep. When it came, my mouth moved before my thoughts did. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. My voice surprised me. Calm, almost cheerful. "I was just calling to check in. Give me a call when you have a minute, okay?" I paused. Long enough to say more. Long enough to change everything. But I didn't. I didn't mention the bank, didn't mention the questions sitting folded on my table, didn't mention the nights I lay awake listening to the house breathe without him. "I hope you're doing all right," I added instead. Then, softer, "I'll talk to you soon." I hung up before I could rethink it. The silence afterward felt immediate. Suddenly, like the house had been holding something up and finally let it drop. The rain kept tapping, steady and unconcerned. I lowered myself onto the couch and stared at the dark screen of the phone. My reflection stared back, faint and unfamiliar. I realized my hands were shaking just enough to notice. What frightened me wasn't that I hadn't said the hard thing. It was how easily I'd avoided it. The message sounded like all the others I'd left over the years. Gentle, reassuring, designed to make things easier for him. Even now, especially now, I set the phone on the coffee table and leaned back listening. The floor creaked somewhere down the hall, like it remembered footsteps that no longer came. The refrigerator hummed. The rain softened. Anger would have felt simpler, louder, more honest, maybe. But what lived in my chest instead was restraint. Care. A voice trained over decades to smooth edges, to protect feelings even at its own expense. I wondered when I'd learn to speak that way, and why it still came so naturally. The house felt too quiet. Not empty, just attentive, as if it had heard everything and was waiting to see what I'd do next. I picked up the phone once more, turning it face down this time. The screen went dark. So did my reflection. Somewhere, concern had learned to whisper, and I didn't know yet what that meant, only that it had changed the sound of my own voice. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the silence stayed. The envelope waited on the table longer than it needed to, white against wood, unopened. Afternoon light moved slowly through the room, catching dust in its path. Tiny particles floated and turned, visible only when they crossed the sun. I watched them for a while, breathing in time with their drift, as if delaying the moment would soften it. I already knew what the paper would say. That was the strange part. When I finally opened it, there was no rush in me, no tightening, just a quiet readiness I didn't recognize until it arrived. The page unfolded the same way the others had. Clean, orderly, patient. Another withdrawal. Same spacing. Same careful amount. Same quiet confidence. I stared at it without blinking. The numbers didn't surprise me this time. They simply settled, like a weight finding its place. Something in my chest eased and sank at the same time. I sat down, though I was already sitting. That's how it felt. The house didn't react. No sudden sound. No warning creak. The clock kept ticking. Outside, a car passed, tires humming briefly before fading away. I thought about how loud I'd expected proof to be, how I'd imagined it would announce itself, demand attention, force a response. But it did end. Single quotes. T.it waited. I traced the line with my finger, then let my hand rest on the table. My name was still at the top of the page. Clear, familiar, unchanged. Yet the story underneath it had grown without me. The dust kept moving through the light. I followed one speck until it disappeared near the window. Another took its place. I realized then that waiting can look like peace if you don't name it. That silence can feel gentle right up until it isn't. There was no point in explaining this one away. No need to practice conversations. No comfort left in possibility. The pattern had repeated itself with too much care to be accidental. What I felt wasn't anger. It was clear. The kind that arrives quietly and rearranges things without asking. I folded the statement and set it beside the first one. They aligned easily, like they'd been waiting for each other. I noticed how steady my hands were, how calm my breathing sounded in the room. That scared me more than panic would have. I stayed at the table longer than usual. Long enough for the light to shift again. Long enough for the room to grow cooler. Long enough to understand that something had already changed, whether I spoke it aloud or not. Proof doesn't always arrive to convince you. Sometimes it arrives to confirm what you already know but haven't accepted. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Images came and went, his face at different ages, his voice in different rooms, laughter I could place exactly in time. Love doesn't disappear when truth arrives. It just stands beside it, unsure of where to look. I opened my eyes and looked at the papers one last time. Not with suspicion, with acknowledgement. The silence between us had been speaking for a while now. I had just learned how to listen. As evening approached, I gathered the statements and placed them neatly into a folder. Not to hide them, to keep them. I wasn't sure yet what I would say, or when. But for the first time, I asked myself the question without flinching. Was I finally ready to name what this silence meant? The phone rang just as the sun slipped behind the trees, that thin hour when the day decides it's done speaking. I was at the table, papers stacked neatly to my right, folded so the numbers stayed hidden. The lamp cast a soft circle of light, leaving the corners of the room untouched. His name lit the screen. Warm, familiar, too sudden. I answered on the second ring. "Hi," I said. His voice came through full and easy, like it used to be. Too easy. "Hey, Mom, I've been meaning to call," he said, already moving forward. I listened. That became my role. He asked about my health, the way people do when they want reassurance, not detail. I said I was fine. He mentioned the weather, how it had been strange lately. I agreed. He asked if Mrs. Keller still walked her dog at dusk. I said she did. The conversation moved smoothly, like a stone skimming water, never sinking, never slowing. I could hear him smiling, not with his eyes, just with his voice. It had a practiced warmth to it, the kind that fills space quickly so nothing else can enter. My fingers rested on the folded paper beside me. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. The weight of it pressed lightly against my hand, as if reminding me it was still there. He talked about work again, about being busy, about plans that stayed vague. I made the right sounds at the right times. I knew how to do that. Mothers learn early. There were pauses where I could have spoken. Small openings. I let them pass. The room felt still, like it was listening too. The floor creaked once beneath my chair, the way it always had. Familiar, loyal. It remembered me even if he didn't. I noticed how carefully he avoided silence, how quickly he filled it when it tried to settle. That told me more than his words ever could. I wanted to say his name the way I used to. Slow, grounding. I didn't. I wanted to ask him when he planned to tell me. I didn't. Instead, I asked about his drive home. He answered easily, too easily. The paper stayed folded. The truth stayed contained. I held them both in place with the same quiet restraint. I realized then what I was afraid of. Not the confrontation, not the answers, the moment itself. This small, ordinary bridge between us. The sound of his voice. The way it almost felt like before. Breaking the truth would mean breaking this. And I wasn't sure which loss would hurt more. He laughed at something I said. A soft laugh. Familiar in shape, unfamiliar in feeling. I smiled even though he couldn't see it. When the call ended, it ended gently. No tension, no sharp edges. Just a promise to talk again soon. I set the phone down slowly. The room exhaled. The paper was still there, waiting, patient, unmoved by warmth or tone. I unfolded it just enough to see the edge of the numbers, then folded it again. Some truths don't need to be seen twice. In the quiet that followed, one question stayed with me, heavier than the rest. Why was I more afraid of breaking the moment than breaking the truth? The light dimmed, the house remembered, and I sat there, knowing the next conversation would not sound the same. The kettle had gone cold on the stove. I noticed because the room felt colder too, even though the heat was on. Evening pressed gently against the windows, turning the glass into mirrors. I could see myself there, older, quieter, still waiting. The phone rested in my hand, warm from before. This time, I didn't let the moment pass. I said his name the way I used to when he was small, slow, careful. The way you speak when you want someone to stop moving and look at you. There was a pause. Not a technical one. An emotional one. It felt like a door opening to cold air. He answered after that. But something had shifted. The warmth thinned. His voice stayed polite, steady, but it no longer floated. It stood still, braced. I imagined him somewhere I couldn't see, choosing words from a shelf already prepared. He began to explain. Not all at once. In pieces. He talked about timing, about stress, about things getting complicated faster than he expected. His reasons arrived neatly, each one fitting into the next like they'd practiced standing together. Nothing rushed, nothing reckless. I listened without interrupting. My hands stayed folded in my lap. The house creaked softly behind me, like it remembered other conversations, louder ones. Years ago, he said he hadn't meant for me to worry, that it wasn't serious, that he was going to fix it. Each sentence sounded reasonable on its own. Together, They left gaps, small spaces where truth might have been, if it had been invited. I didn't argue, didn't accuse, didn't raise my voice. I waited until he finished. Then I asked the question that had been sitting with me all along. When were you planning to tell me? The silence that followed was different from the others. It didn't rush to be filled. He inhaled. I could hear it clearly, like the microphone had moved closer to his chest. When he spoke again, the words came slower, less sure. Soon he said he'd been meaning to. He just hadn't found the right moment. I nodded. Though he couldn't see me, I understood what he meant. We spend our lives waiting for moments that don't exist. The disappointment arrived quietly. No heat. No sharp edge. It settled in me the way dust does, slowly, evenly, without asking permission. Anger would have demanded something. An apology. A reaction. Anger wants resolution. It wants to be seen. Disappointment doesn't ask for anything. It just stays. I thought about all the times I'd taught him to tell the truth early. How I'd said it gently then too. How I believed gentleness would make things easier. The conversation wound down on its own. No final blow. No clear ending. Just the understanding that something between us had changed shape. We said goodbye the way people do when they're careful not to touch something tender. When the call ended, I didn't move. The phone rested against my ear for a moment longer, like I was listening for something beneath the silence. I lowered it slowly and placed it on the table. The room felt still, not broken, just altered. I realized then why disappointment felt heavier than anger, because anger burns through you and leaves. But disappointment stays and doesn't ask to be forgiven. Outside, night settled fully. Inside, the house held its breath, and I knew the next part of the truth would not come easily. The house settled after the call the way it always did. Softly, carefully. As if nothing had happened, the clock resumed its steady ticking. The refrigerator hummed low and constant. Somewhere down the hall, the floor creaked once, then went still. These sounds had carried me through years. They were familiar enough to feel like company, but tonight, they landed differently. I stood at the table for a long moment, looking at the folder in front of me. The papers inside were aligned neatly, edges squared, the way I like things. Order has always been comforting, a way to believe that if things look right, they might be right. I slid the papers back into place and closed the folder slowly. Not with relief, with intention. I carried it to the hallway drawer, the one beneath the old mirror with the hairline crack. I paused there, my hand resting on the handle, listening to the quiet stretch around me. Then I placed the folder inside and pushed the drawer shut. It didn't feel like hiding anything. It felt like drawing a line. I realized then that evidence isn't always for proving something to others. Sometimes it's for reminding yourself what you're no longer willing to ignore. The room behind me stayed unchanged. Same furniture, same shadows, same soft light coming through the windows as evening leaned in. But I felt altered within it, like a chair moved slightly out of place, still useful, just no longer unnoticed. I walked to the window and rested my palm against the glass. The sky had begun to dim, colors thinning into gray-blue. A porch light flicked on across the street. Someone laughed briefly, then disappeared inside. Life continuing, unbothered. I thought about trust, how I'd always imagined it as something solid, like a bridge you cross without looking down. I understood now it was more like water shifting, adapting, finding new paths when the old ones break. Trust hadn't vanished between my son and me. It had changed shape, and love was still there, quiet, persistent. But it no longer meant silence. I wouldn't smooth over questions just to keep peace. I wouldn't fold truth away because it felt inconvenient. Loving him didn't require me to disappear inside my own patience. That understanding didn't bring anger. It brought steadiness. I turned off the lamp and let the room darken naturally. The last of the light slipped across the floor, catching dust as it fell. I watched until it faded completely. In the darkness, the house felt honest. No corners pretending to be brighter than they were. No shadows trying to hide. I sat down and breathed slowly. feeling the quiet around me settle again, not heavy this time, not hollow. Different. As night fully arrived, one question remained. Not sharp, not urgent, just present. What does peace look like when truth finally speaks? I didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time, I knew where to listen.